Good evening. Welcome to the Bridge for Early Career Preachers Bridge conversation on preaching and spirituality. This is our second conversation for 2025. For those of you who are just finding out about who the Bridge for Early Career Preachers is, we have a mission to provide resources, continuing education, and a supportive community for those who are moving from aspiring to active preaching ministries. So we're here for those of you in your first years of preaching. We continue to learn with you and to walk with you as you make your way in the preaching life. Welcome as well to those of you who are a little further along in the preaching life. I'm always confident that you'll find something in these conversations that will feed you. My name is Rich Voles, and I serve as Associate Professor of Preaching and Worship at Union Presbyterian Seminary. I'm also the director of the Bridge for Early Career Preachers, and I will serve as our host and moderator tonight. If you have comments or questions at any time, please feel free to submit those in the chat. I will keep an eye on those in real time, and we'll also reserve some time at the end for us to address some questions. So think about what you might like to follow up on or to ask as you hear from our panelists tonight. Tonight, we are joined by three amazing guests who bring different lenses to our conversation. They're here to share their knowledge, their experiences, and their wisdom about our topic. So let me introduce them, and then we will dive right into the conversation. First of all, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Cressman, who serves as the founding steward of Backstory Preaching. Launched in 2016, Backstory Preaching is an ecumenical, all online ministry for lay and ordained preachers to help them thrive in the process, craft, and spirituality of preaching for their entire ministries. She's ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church and has been since 1993. And before Backstory Preaching, Lisa served congregations in Indiana, Minnesota, and Texas. She's a spiritual director, workshop leader, keynote speaker, and the author of the books Backstory Preaching, Integrating Life, Spirituality, and Craft, and the gospel people don't want to hear, preaching challenging messages. She's also a wife, a mom, mixed media artist, musician, outdoor enthusiast, yogi, and swinger of kettlebells, which may also be spiritual. I'm guessing it is in some ways. Next up, we have the Reverend Larry Morris, J. Morris III, who is a Disciples of Christ minister in Chicago, Illinois. He's the executive director and lead pastor of the Inclusive Collective, a progressive campus ministry in the Chicagoland area, a spiritual director, and a homiletic coach. Reverend Morris is a PhD student in Chicago Theological Seminary's African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric program. And you can learn more about Larry at LarryJMorris3.com. And then finally, Trey Clark. Trey Clark is assistant professor of preaching and spiritual formation and dean of the chapel at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's author of Black Contemplative Preaching, A Hidden History of Prayer, Proclamation, and Prophetic Witness. He lives with his family in Southern California. Welcome to all three of you. I'm so glad that you're here. So let's get started. And Larry, our first question is going to come to you. So tell us, Larry, what's the relationship between preaching and spirituality? Get us started here.
All right. Well, I want to begin with one of my favorite definitions of spirituality that I kind of ground my preaching and my spiritual life in. And it's from Dr. Mona West. She writes that spirituality is the practice of staying consciously connected with what makes us alive, God, ourselves, and others. She says that while spirituality is a broad word covering very different types of experiences, it is also a word that's rooted in particularity. She says that gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and being a member of a particular community all impact and shape one's spirituality. So for me, preaching is spiritual, right? Preaching is a part of a spiritual practice. For me, preaching, again, is not separate from spirituality, but it is a form of spirituality. It's also grounded in our connection to God, ourselves, and community. And preaching, when done right, we have our idea what preaching is when it's done right, is, again, with spiritual integrity, right? With our connection, our real lived connection, again, with the divine, with also ourselves in the communities that we preach with, and it's contextual, right? So our preaching can change over time, depending on who we're preaching with, and kind of also what's going on in our lives and with our relationship with God. And so, again, preaching for me and spirituality are connected, very much so.
I love that connected piece. And I love this phrase that you used, spiritual integrity. I have a feeling we're going to talk more about that tonight, but I want to like highlight that right now. So thanks for getting us started, Larry. Lisa, how about you? What's the relationship between preaching and spirituality?
Yeah, Larry, thank you for kicking this off. And yeah, I also love that phrase, the spiritual integrity. Boy, if we're going to preach authentically and honestly what we genuinely believe, it has to be integral to who we are. So, one of the ways I understand the relationship between preaching and spirituality is the word made flesh. That if the word of God was made flesh and is incarnational throughout all of time and history through the Spirit, through us as preachers, then that word is coming through this. And it's the only tool God has to work with because we're human beings and we are fleshly persons. So it's all God has to work with if the word is going to be talked about and shared. And so preaching and spirituality get combined when we allow ourselves to abide in the word and the word abides in us and is filtered through our backstories. So, who we are as human beings and the very particular uniqueness that each of us is, because every one preacher is the only preacher in all of history who can preach the sermon they can preach. They're the one and only time that particular voice through those experiences, that education, that genealogy, all the things can only go through this one person in my lifetime for me. And that is true of every person. So the more we can integrate our personhoods, our authenticity, what we genuinely believe, and put all of that in service of God, then the more authentically we preach. And then preaching and spirituality are not separate things. They actually get integrated again as one practice.
Thanks, Lisa. I wonder if I could follow up just a little bit. You talked about the marriage of the spiritual and the physical. And I wonder before I come to Trey with this question, if you could just kind of trace us through that, because that sounds like to me, often enough, I think we have sort of these two in very different realms, right? The physical is physical, the spiritual is spiritual. And when we talk about preaching or when we talk about just the life in general, that we can keep those two separate. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So when I was in seminary, way back when in the 80s, early 90s, what I was taught was that the preacher has to be removed from the text, that the goal was to find the pure essence of the text, discover that, and preach that. But I don't think that's possible. It's just not possible for us not to bring our whole selves to the text. And so, in the ways that text is entering into my life, it's mushing around in all the things of who I am and how I go through the world in space, through time and space. I mean, my preaching now in my early 60s is different than it was in my 20s because I'm simply older. And that makes a difference for the way the word is going through my body than it did back when. That also includes things like disability and our families of origin, our ancestry. All of those things are coming through the particularity of this physical being. And so, again, the physical, the spiritual, the preaching, all of that really is one thing.
That's very helpful and super important. Thank you for following that for us. Trey, how about you? What's the relationship between preaching and spirituality?
Yeah, I'm enjoying being able to listen to the helpful insights from Larry and Lisa. Yeah, I would add for me, the assumption that begin with is that if the Spirit of God is universally present at work around us and in us, then each element of preaching is inherently intertwined with the work of the Spirit. And so that means that the life that I live shows up in my preaching for better or for worse, right? Who I am in relationship with the divine cannot be fully hidden when it comes to the act of preaching. Then on another level, I think the sermon itself is a spiritual event because it can become a kind of corporate spiritual encounter with the living God. And then beyond just the formation of the preacher and the act of the preaching, the afterlife of the sermon itself is in many ways dependent on us trusting the ongoing work of the Spirit beyond the words that we offer. So from beginning to end, for me, the interrelationship between preaching and spirituality is really central. And I appreciate, I think it was James Forbes who talked about how the preaching event from start to finish is a full-blooded working out of a theology of the Spirit. I'm paraphrasing him here. But I think that's a very important insight that brings together these two things that could potentially be seen as separate.
Yeah, and as we track this down, I'm also interested in the sort of misconceptions, right? So I think Lisa has sort of pointed us one way where we think, the physical is divorced from the spiritual. Are there other misconceptions that we might have about this relationship between preaching and spirituality? Any of you?
I can jump into that because I work with working preachers exclusively from around the globe at this point. And I would say the biggest misconception is that these two things have nothing to do with each other. I work with so many preachers who come to this with an understanding that it's an academic discipline exclusively, that they are trying to preach the right answer, the right theology. And sometimes there's so much anxiety about making sure that they do it right. And so spending hours and hours and hours in exegesis trying to get the one correct thing that they are supposed to say. And it is revelatory to say, what if this were also a spiritual practice? What if you were actually a part of this and this was a time that you get to run away with God? And I mean, who gets paid for this but us? I mean, people pay us to go spend time with God. How cool is that? So the privilege that this is, that we get to go encounter the Word of God and wallow in it for a while, and then find a word to bring back to our people that we actually believe because the good news just happened to us. So we get to go and say, come and see what I have just discovered about this man who knows everything about me. Come and see. So the biggest problem, I think, is when we think that these two things are disconnected.
That's a really helpful and not just helpful in what you said, but also the enthusiasm with which you say it. And I don't mean that in a dismissive sort of way or to trivialize it. I think like that's invitational, I think, for many of us. Larry, Trey, either of you want to get in here about misconceptions about the relationship between preaching and spirituality?
I love Lisa's insight and her enthusiasm. I find my joy and excitement about preaching rising whenever I get the chance to hear her. So thank you, Lisa, for that. Yeah, one thing that I would mention is that at least for some folks, I know that when they hear the word spirituality, it can trigger this notion of, oh, that's just talking about a private kind of individualized relationship between you and Jesus. And I think that if anything, the exploration of preaching and spirituality invites us to a much more expansive, robust understanding of how God is at work through individuals and communities to impact the world through preaching. So in many ways, I think that reductionistic understanding of spirituality falls apart when it's tethered, when preaching and spirituality are tethered together. We begin to see that preaching really is a theological act that invites us into an integration of ourselves and community with the world. So spirituality, when it's not reduced to simply an individualistic affair or fuzzy feelings, we can have a more expansive, holistic understanding of proclamation as this act that invites us to be caught up in the work of the triune God and to bear witness to the liberating, life-giving gospel of Jesus.
Y'all are bringing the goods. We've got a whole hour, so hold on. So, Larry, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly. I agree with this idea that spirituality can sometimes seem like detached and abstract, while preaching can sometimes feel like it's public, right, and performative, right? So you have these two dichotomies, but they're both communal and contextual, right? Our spiritual lives and spirituality is a contextual. It's contextual. It's not just something that we do by ourselves or something that's stagnant. It can change over time, and other folks are involved in that. And so again, holding preaching and spirituality together, as folks have already mentioned, but in a way that is public, communal and contextual, I think is also again helpful.
That's really important. All right, let's forge ahead to our next question. And Lisa, we'll come to you with this one. With so many different goals for preaching, and we have lots of different things that we might try to accomplish over the course of our preaching in a congregational setting. Why and how do we prioritize preaching as the work of spiritual formation for the congregation, and what might that look like?
Yeah, one of the ways I like to understand the broad nature of what we do in the proclamation of the word is to compare it to what we do in pastoral care. So when we have a pastoral care appointment, it's generally one-to-one, and we are listening deeply to the concerns of that person. And often there is prayer, and often there is a felt sense of the presence of the Spirit moving and releasing that person, bringing them some kind of freedom, some kind of healing in that moment. What preaching can do, or what preaching does, is rather than thinking of it as one-to-one pastoral care, is that it's one-to-many, is that it is one-to-many. And in the same way that pastoral care is listening deeply to the concerns of one person, in preaching, we are listening deeply to the concerns of the entire community, and not only those who will be there listening to us specifically, but also, of course, the community context in which that congregation resides, the world of which we are a part. And there's often prayer, of course, in the service. There is also a felt sense of the presence that is moving through, releasing us, finding healing, finding hope, a way forward, that what is right now is one moment in time, and we are always being drawn into, invited into the reign of God that is still being built. So the spiritual aspect of preaching is inherent to what we do. And when we can make that analogy, it can be helpful for people to understand, oh, right, that's what I'm about. It's not simply that I'm talking to a whole bunch of people. It is that we are going on a spiritual journey, a theological journey together in order to be transformed to become the body of Christ all together as one.
I love that, and it so connects with what both Larry and Trey have said about the communal nature, right? So spirituality not just as this privatized individual exercise, but one that's communal and shared among us. Trey, what would you add here? How do we prioritize preaching as the work of spiritual formation for the congregation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think on the one hand, preaching as spiritual formation is one important purpose of preaching alongside many others in pastoral ministry. Augustine talked about the sermon's aim is to teach and delight and persuade. But on the other hand, I think in pastoral ministry, preaching as spiritual formation can be understood as this broader frame into which the other purposes of preaching find their ultimate end. So one way to think about this is to pick up on that word that Lisa shared, prayer. If, and I think Tom Troger talks about prayer as the end or the telos of preaching. So if prayer, or we might say leading others into communion with God, is an end of preaching, well, we do that while teaching. We do that while prophetic messages that challenge the ways in which barriers prevent us from fully, as all in all our diversity, living in communion with God on earth. I also find that thinking about prayer or formation as a broader purpose or end for preaching can bring together some things that are separate and help the sermon preparation process and the delivery of the sermon itself to be connected to how we live out our spiritual lives. So I do think that the other purposes of preaching are important: teaching, correcting, challenging, mission, all those things are important. But I find preaching as formation or spiritual formation as integrally connected with those other purposes.
That's a really important frame, and helping us connect those pieces, I think, is really important. Thanks for that. Larry, how about you?
Yeah, so I see the preaching spiritual formation as a way to help to shape a community's capacity to notice God, right? Long term, to notice God, to notice also what's going on around us in our communities and the world, and what's happening inside of us, right? And so, again, this journey is the language that I think Lisa used earlier. But this journey, this walking with folks, as they notice the divine in themselves and community, that leads towards transformation, right? And so, the goal or the hope is that we are transformed to be more just, more loving, more bold, more courageous in our actions. Again, not just from this theoretical lens or just having a part of our mind change, but also that it leads to some action in the world, right? Some action in our communities and in the lives of the folks that we love and the folks that we are learning to love. And so, again, I really love the language that Lisa used earlier around preaching as this one to many, right? I love that idea in the language, and the shaping, right? The molding, the invitation to see God differently than what one has seen God before. But again, not just the divine, not just God, but also the folks that we live with and that we see daily. And I think, preaching can allow us to not only think differently, but also engage with an openness in the spirit that's kind of hard to name, right? You know something is happening, you can sense something. May not always have the language for it, but I think really good and effective preaching does that for community members and for individuals, but also community as a whole.
The language you use there, again, Larry, I'm going to pick up on something just in the very particularity of what you said, the capacity to notice God.
Yeah.
I confess, I probably don't normally operate with that sort of vision for what preaching is. And so you're teaching me, you're helping me tonight. And you added on top of that. So the capacity to notice God, and I think you said something like, and to notice each other and to notice what's inside of us. I love this sense of what you are drawing us into in terms of being able to sense God more deeply, to be able to discern the community, and then being, more self-aware, more self-reflective, notice what's going on with us, within us, and how God is dealing with us internally in the moment. I just y'all are teaching me. Thank you, thank you for this. Anything else to add here, y'all? Want to follow a trail or offer a comment on something that you've heard?
Well, I'm just really struck by Larry's helpful invitation to think about preaching as noticing God and what's inside of us and the world around us. And I'm just thinking about the kind of life that makes that kind of noticing possible, which is a kind of countercultural life. Like, it's difficult for me to live into that without challenging my addiction to speed and going faster and faster, right? And so just thinking about the invitation to notice God and others and ourselves in and through the act of preaching is also this invitation into a kind of unhurried preaching life.
I love that. An unhurried preaching life. I think this is a good place to come to our next question, Trey, which is going to start with you. So you're getting us down this road already, but how do we balance this technical, process-driven work? Lisa's already pointed us the way to sort of thinking about it as an academic, oftentimes exercise. How do we balance the technical, process-driven work of preaching with preaching as or preaching informed by spiritual practice? Trey, get us started.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to say other than because I'm really drawn to this language here that Larry is naming, noticing God. For me, the question is, do I create space in my sermon preparation process to attend to what God is speaking? Or is my sermon preparation process all about my effort, my insight, my knowledge, how clever I can be? Do I create space? What openings do I have in my sermon preparation process through which the Spirit might speak? And for me, that pushes against preaching simply being not simply an individualistic act, but something that I can do on my own resources. Not only do I need the divine, but I also need community. And so that moves preaching from being simply a technical process-driven activity to this more holistic spiritual activity that is also attuned to how God might be meeting me in and through the sermon preparation process in prayer and in conversation with others. Another way to think about it is, how do I maintain a kind of porous presence, one that is open always to the invitations and the interruptions of the Spirit, even as I'm brainstorming and outlining and drafting and crafting in my sermon preparation process?
A porous presence. Y'all are killing me tonight. A porous presence. Who among us does not want to be that? Yeah, Larry, keep us going here.
I don't know. I'm still sitting with that porous presence as well. I had to take a sip of water real quick. So I think it's more about integrating like the technical process-driven work of preaching with spirituality. Not seeing them again as two separate things, but how do we integrate them? I think it is easy sometimes for us to, once we have our sermon process done, we know what the flow is going to be, we can get in this rhythm, which is not necessarily wrong or bad, but this rhythm of, we know how to put a sermon together, right? And in some contexts, we may know how to get a reaction from the congregation, right? So, but again, as Trey reminded us, it's about slowing down and integrating the divine God in the whole process of preaching, right? And so not just exegeting like the text, right, as a spiritual practice, but how do we exegete the congregation or the community that we are preaching with, and even exegete ourselves, right? What's going on in my life in this particular moment? And again, it's not something that may happen every time you preach, but it is developing a rhythm and an awareness of presence of God in the process. And I think developing a way to see the process as a spiritual practice. And so, I do believe that preachers should have other spiritual practices, right, besides just preaching. But preaching in that process can be a spiritual practice, right? It can be something that's done with intention, where you're you want to make sure you get the technical pieces right, but you're also aware of the divine throughout the process, right? Even as you're reading scripture, may just take a moment just to read it, for it to enter into your spirit, right? And not just your mind, not just trying to figure out the words that's coming out, but allow it to resonate within yourself first. So again, I think we'll talk about that later, some actual practices, but creating space, and yeah, space and slowing down. I really like this, again, this idea of slowing down, because once you start preaching often enough, if we have particular sermons that we can rework for other contexts, it may be easy to do that. But we miss like, what is the divine inviting us to in this particular moment? What is God speaking in this moment that may be similar to something we preached before, but it may be something new. We won't know that unless we are intentional on creating space and spaciousness in our preaching formation, but also preaching life.
And that really requires, again, y'all are pressing this, to think about preaching in a different frame. And I think perhaps many of us learn in our preaching classes, learn our way out of this, right? This is very much an academic exercise. In many institutions, you're going to get a grade for it, right? And that can divorce the propulsion of our lives toward considering preaching as a spiritual practice to get it right. So Lisa, keep on for us. Follow this down a little bit more. You've already started talking about this, so help us.
Yeah, well, I'm basking at the feet of my colleagues here, because this is just such great stuff, and I'm so grateful to be hearing from them too. So this is really the heart and soul of backstory preaching. And we developed a process whereby we apply Lectio Divina to sermon prep. So briefly, Lectio Divina is an ancient spiritual practice that has 4 different stages to it. Lectio, to read; meditatio, to study; oratio, to pray or express; and contemplatio, to rest in God. So we created a particular way to apply those 4 stages, so that when we read the text initially, that is sacred time and sacred space. So we develop a liturgy to prepare ourselves before we go to the text, and we read the text slowly, carefully, naively, as if we've never seen it before, with a beginner's mind, but slowly, and preferably early in the week so that it has time to steep. Meditatio is study. Typically, we understand that as the time we do exegesis, but at backstory preaching, we don't talk about it, exegesis, as being only to gather information, but it is formational exegesis. It is formational for the preacher, that as we are learning and studying about the text, we come to it with a vulnerability that says to the Spirit, I am willing to be changed. Change me to become more like you through the process of what I am learning. Oratio is the proclamation part, where we are putting the whole thing together to figure out what we are going to say and offer that is something we genuinely believe to be true about God and is relevant to our listeners. And then contemplatio, the resting, happens throughout the week. What we know from creative studies about the neurology that happens with creativity, we know that having blank space in between efforts, in between sessions of effort, is where the best ideas come from. So not only is it more efficient, but it also helps to develop sermon prep as a spiritual practice. When we do a little bit, and then we let it go, and we rest in God. We do a little bit more, we let it go, we rest in God. And in that way, really, sermon prep becomes almost effortless. We bring our whole selves, but what the Spirit is able to do in that is to bring the sermon to us. I'm not saying there isn't effort, and I'm also not saying we still have to do it on a deadline. But it's going back to what Trey says. There's a difference between that this is all on me and this is me with the Spirit. And then the final thing I'll say is that at Backstory Preaching, because we're all online, we do all of this in community every single week, 52 weeks a year. every single stage of sermon prep is we can do it in community so that it is not an isolated event.
I love that. This sense of sermon preparation as vulnerability and as a willingness to be changed. I think I think so often, and I'm going to put different language to what you said, Lisa. We feel like our job is to master the text and to master the sermon. And what you're inviting us to is a willingness to be vulnerable, right? To flip the power in the opposite direction, and re-examine, the posture or the disposition with which we approach the text, approach the congregation, approach the spirit, is really something that is foundational, and can be transformative for us as preachers. Thank you for that. Y'all want to follow up anything here? Chase anything down?
I think the only thing I'll say is I'm a huge fan of Lisa's book, Backstory Preaching. I think I assign it in some shape or form in almost every preaching class I teach. It's one of the most helpful, practical resources for integrating one's spirituality into preaching. And so I think that process really is accessible and provides handles for people who are hungry for a different way of engaging the act of preaching, moving from it being one of exhaustion to it being life-giving. So I can't highly recommend that process that she articulates enough.
Thanks, Troy.
Something that's coming up for me is, and I appreciate Lisa naming this, is even the preaching process does not have to be individual. It can be communal. And so, I don't always do this, but sometimes when I have conversations with other preachers or other people about the text that I'm considering preaching or the text that, may be assigned, it's generative and it's helpful. And I think sometimes we can be taught that, again, that preaching in the process is an individual, like secret, go alone in your room, quiet, your place of study act. And then we bring people in sometimes once we have our ideas or, we want to test an idea. But no, from the beginning through the whole process, it can be this communal process and this communal activity. So again, when I've done that, it's been helpful. And it's not a practice that I always have. But again, it's just a reminder that preaching, again, is not just this individual personal thing.
Thanks, Larry. So we've been leading to this question, but and I'm excited to hear from y'all because of the different perspectives, the different modes that you walk through this world with. But what are the spiritual resources and practices from which you draw for preaching? We're not going to be able to be exhaustive about all of the possibilities for spiritual resources. So I just want to offer that as kind of a user warning, beware. We're not going to say everything that can be said. But I'm curious to know, what are the spiritual resources and practices from which you draw for preaching? So Larry, can we start with you on this?
Yes, I think one is I do spiritual direction, but I also have a spiritual director, either individual or group spiritual direction, because I think it's important for preachers to also give attention to our spiritual lives, right? Outside of preaching. And if we're honest, everything's not always great, right? In our own spiritual lives, right? It's not always flowing well, and we always feel connected to God in this really close way. But we need space and support to deal with that. When I think about spiritual integrity, it doesn't mean that everything's great. It means that we're honest about our spiritual lives, right? And that we have support and resources to tend to what's happening with us. Another thing that comes to my mind is rituals, right? These processes of, ways of being, ways of doing something, not in a way that stifles creativity, but it's helpful to have a routine that we can follow, so that even when we don't feel like doing the work of preaching, right? This rhythm that we have committed ourselves to aids in our ability to complete the process, but also engage the divine and trust that God will be with us, through that and meet us somewhere in this ritual. So I think those two things are, I think, the things that are on top of my mind at this particular moment.
That's great. We may have folks joining us tonight who aren't aware or of what spiritual direction involves or what it entails. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that process looks like? We're lucky enough to have two spiritual directors on with us tonight. So, Larry, could you talk to us a little bit more about what that process is and what it looks like for folks who may be unfamiliar?
Yes, the way that I see spiritual direction is either one-on-one or in a small group, and it really is just listening, and asking curious questions. I think one of the ways that someone's defined spiritual direction is listening others into wholeness, right? So it's a non-judgmental space. I have clients who say things in spiritual direction that they may not share, or they said they haven't shared in other places. Um, I see it as dancing and wrestling with the divine. Again, it's not just God, but God, ourselves, and community. But it is a space um, of care, of listening, non-judgmental, not trying to fix anything, but really wanting to hold folks in ways that they really feel held and supported. And a lot of the folks that I work with, we integrate like our social location and our identities, right, into spiritual direction practice, and integrate some of the things that we've learned, right, about God that may not be helpful um, or life giving. And so that's a brief kind of description of spiritual direction, at least from my lens.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Thanks for that. And I love the idea of rituals as well. So I don't, again, I'm sort of fessing up here. I don't know that I begin my sermon preparation process with a kind of ritual. And so you've got me thinking about what that might look like for me. What kind of habit might I, or symbolic act that might I enter into that sort of marks this off as spiritual practice, as holy space. So I really appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Lisa, how about you?
Yeah, I'm with Larry on those things, and also having your own regularly practiced uh, times of prayer that are not with church. I mean, church is great for prayer, but it has a different purpose than the time set apart when we be like Jesus and we go off to a quiet place by ourselves, and when there is no place to hide and all of who we are is offered to God. And as Larry said so well, that's the time that we can wrestle. In addition, I want to offer a couple of perhaps different ways of thinking about resources and practices for our preaching. One is, if we believe in our baptisms that we are to respect the dignity of every human being, that includes ourselves. And one of the ways that we can respect the dignity of every human being is with boundaries. What is okay with us and what is not okay with us, what we're willing to do, what we're not willing to do, prioritizing what is most important to us, and what are the things we can let go of. So, for example, if we want a less frantic and more spiritually filled life, and including our preaching, then turn off our phones. I even have my phone turned off. I don't have haptics going anymore, and my life is so much better. I just check my phone periodically. If it's an emergency, somebody can telephone me. If it's, I mean, they can, call, not just text. So that's a kind of practice of, we do not have to be accessible 24/7. We let ourselves be accessible because we choose it. That is not respecting my dignity of, I need space, I need time, I need not to be accessible to other people for periods of time, for prayer, for sermon prep, and so on. The other is that I see in my work with preachers that sermon prep is often relegated to the margins. And what that really means is sermon prep is happening in our personal time, like on Saturday nights. And when that is happening, if it is not being done during our designated work hours, then sermon prep has become our volunteer job. Now, if that's okay with you, then God bless you and keep going. But if that is causing you stress, or if that is causing your household stress, because it's not just ourselves who are involved, we often have loved ones and it affects them. So deciding what is actually the most important thing for me. If it really is serving God, respecting my dignity, respecting the dignity of those I love, then I have to have boundaries. And I have to say sermon prep is going to require for me, and everyone gets to choose for themselves, the number of hours it takes. For some preachers, it's 8 hours. For some, it's 20. The number of hours doesn't matter. It's if that's what it requires you, how will you put up the boundaries to protect it? And you are the only person who will protect those boundaries. Everybody else in your life is going to try to push against them and try to get more of your attention. So a spiritual practice is saying, I can do this much and I can't do those other things. As important and as valuable as they are for the ministry of God, I can't do them. Someone else has to pick that up. So a spiritual practice is not letting ourselves be accessible to all people all the time, and being clear about our boundaries. And sermon prep is one of the most important things we can do on behalf of the entire congregation. And so it's a spiritual practice to say no to other things.
Yeah, and if preaching is itself a spiritual practice on behalf of the community, then it, to my mind at least, it becomes a little bit easier to draw those boundaries, right? It's not just
Mhm.
this sort of cog in the wheel of what I have to do during the week. No, this is the spiritual care for my congregation and for myself.
Right.
So it becomes easier. And I think the other thing to add on to that is, I would say just because it's spiritual doesn't mean it happens on a whim, right? So the late Dale Andrews said one time in a class I was TAing for him, he said something like, the spirit doesn't just clock in on Saturday night, right? The
Right.
spirit's active all through the week, right? And I think what he meant by that is that the spirit is available to us, and like that this is a discipline, right? It doesn't just happen on a whim. It's not just kind of a random moments of inspiration. It's something we build into our lives. uh, Trey, what about you? Help us with this conversation.
Yeah, just maybe I would add a couple of things. One, I've noticed that one of the great factors that leads to exhaustion and depletion in sermon preparation and delivery is when a person is operating with unrealistic expectations of what constitutes a good sermon. And so really trying to prayerfully spend some time interrogating, what are the assumptions that I operate with as I'm preparing to preach? And are those the assumptions that are actually the things that I want to be assuming about this practice of preaching? Specifically, I think a lot of times people feel like they have to show up in a certain way in the sermonic moment that maybe is not incongruent with the grain of their own wood, to use some of the language of Howard Thurman. But also there's this expectation that people will be impressed, that people will respond a certain way. And so how can we interrogate those assumptions around what constitutes a great sermon? And how can we shift, to use the language of one person, from seeking to impress people to bless people? I find that I'm much more exhausted as a preacher if my motivation is to impress them, rather if I'm just saying, Lord, I just want to be a blessing. Like that is my aim. My hands are open. I'm not trying to control the sermonic event, and I can trust the consequences of the sermon to God and not try to control them myself. The other thing I would mention is Larry spoke earlier about rituals. And I often think about what are the rituals of replenishment, that I need to create post sermon. I don't know about you all, but oftentimes I find after sermons, after preaching, I am exhausted. I can be grumpy. I can be quite mean, right? Get into arguments after sermons because I've just given of myself in such a deep way and I'm depleted. And I need to recover, not just spiritually, but also emotionally, physically, mentally. And so trying to carefully construct rituals of replenishment has been a helpful process in me being able to engage in the ministry of preaching without constantly depleting myself at the level of the soul so that I don't have anything to offer in the future.
Ooh, that is so good. That is so good. Rituals of replenishment. And I'll also add here, Trey, you're being shy about your own work. But I would recommend to you all Trey's book. I think one of the things that we can engage in is learning from other preachers. And in Trey's book, we meet, perhaps some of us for the first time, some really fantastic preachers that teach us what it is like to have a spiritual presence and to think about preaching as a spiritual practice and to incorporate that. So I would also say, keep your eyes out for those from whom we can learn, right? About how the preaching life is varied, right? In the way that it constructs itself as spiritual practice. And you will find some gems in Trey's book. So I highly commend that to you, not just to read, but to also develop a lens for viewing those in your path and probing them, thinking, how is it that you operate, so and so, and in what ways do you find spiritual replenishment, rituals of replenishment? In what ways do you feed yourself as you go through the sermon process through the week? It can be really helpful. So I would encourage you all to track that down. Fantastic. Anything y'all want to follow up on here before we move into our final question?
I have this thought around also just practicing joy, right, and delight. I think sometimes preaching can feel so serious because it is serious and important work. We forget just to practice joy and delight, whether it, in our preaching process or in our spiritual lives. That joy is resistance, right? And if we're preaching, sometimes those thoughts get in our head that we didn't say the right thing or do the right thing, and really just resisting those thoughts and those feelings, and finding ways to delight, right, throughout our day, in our preaching, but also outside of that. So I just wanted to lift that up. I know that sometimes preaching can feel so resistant, preaching against like empire and things of that nature. But it's also important to remember that we should be happy and practice some joy. We can smile and be delightful at times as well.
I love that. Lisa or Trey, anything else you want to add here?
I'd add, in addition to what Larry just said, the word awe, to place ourselves where we will be awed. So one of the things, for example, that I do is I subscribe to the Webb telescope stuff. So when new images from the Webb telescope come out, I get a notification, and then which always just makes me go, and having that feeling always reminds me there's something way bigger, and the glory of God is all around us. So finding those ways to encounter awe for you is helpful to me as well.
Yeah, and if preaching is part of what draws us in connection to the divine, being able to be in awe ourselves of the divine is so important. Thank you for that. Trey, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, as Larry was speaking, I was thinking about, I had a student recently, she was really articulating the importance of play in preaching. And it made me think, that's something I want to lean into more. What does it mean to engage the act of preparing and delivering sermons as an act of play with spirit and community? How might that shift some of the pressure to perform and lead to new creativity in the act of proclamation?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'll cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, I was also going to just mention two books that I found helpful that kind of explore preaching and spirituality, particularly as Larry was speaking earlier about preaching as this kind of act of spiritual direction. Like Kay Northcutt has a book called Kindling Desire for God, and then Unju Mary Kim's book, Preaching the Presence of God. Although it's not specifically on preaching as spiritual direction, it provides a helpful conversation partner for anyone interested in thinking about this intersection of preaching and spirituality more robustly.
Yeah, that's good. And I was just gonna, as I was interrupting you, my apologies, Trey. I was just gonna give two quick shout outs. One is to my colleague Lakeisha Lockhart here at the seminary, who writes on play. And anybody who has encountered Lakeisha or her work is invited into the holy, joyful work of play. And so I would encourage folks to go there. But also, one of our colleagues in the Academy of Homiletics, Casey Sigmund, who runs the Pause Play Center, who encourages us around rest and play. And so I would invite you all to get connected with her. I do want to point to something in the chat real quick before we move forward on this notion of joy. One of my wonderful former students, Jamie, says, I wonder if some of the choosing joy is watching and listening to others simply to appreciate each other's preaching, leaving behind comparison or competition. Just listening and experiencing for the purpose of appreciating fellow preachers and diverse preaching styles. Yes. Amen. I think that is part of it, right? Is that delight in the gifts of the Creator, the gifts of the the Creator for many and varied gifts and expressions of preaching. I think is an entirely helpful preaching practice that explores a range of spirituality. We're going to keep building on our on this question of resources and practices. I've included this because I get this question all the time from beginning preachers, from those who are in our cohorts around the first few years and are really trying to figure out how to work preaching into their very busy lives and work weeks. So, how might preachers incorporate spiritual practices in and apart from their preaching work? And then what daily and weekly rhythms might be fruitful? Lisa, if you could get us started here, you've already in some ways sort of set us down this path. So tell us a little more.
Yeah, we really love what we do for the most part. I mean, most of us feel so lucky to preach and that we are able to spend our careers in the church. And a lot of times that love goes a little too far into sort of perfectionism of I have to do it right all the time, and that includes spiritual practices. This does not have to be rocket science. I love what Trey said about replenishment. Is what does it take to replenish you? And it doesn't have to take a lot of time. Spending 5 minutes in breathing, practicing yoga for 10 minutes, looking at a Webb telescope image for 30 seconds. There are a lot of different ways that we can incorporate spirituality. And that includes, of course, we have seasons of our lives. If you're working in a church and you have young children, then a lot of times the spirituality can come in being in awe of your children, of playing with them, and with the intentionality that the Spirit is also a part of it. Slowing down and drinking coffee in the morning and not doing anything else. Just focus on sipping the coffee. That's all. So having spirituality, building it into our lives is actually really simple. It's intentionality, and a lot of times it's intentionality with things we already do.
I love that. Thank you, Lisa. Trey?
Yeah, I resonate with what Lisa shared. I would just mention some other practices or rhythms that I found helpful in my own life, and I know many other preachers do. One is just having a rhythm of Sabbath. I know that might look different and for different folks in different seasons of life and different contexts, but what is your rhythm for regularly stopping to delight, and to rest. Um, Ideally on a weekly basis, even if that's an afternoon, even if it's a half day, what is your rhythm of resting so that you can live in your being, the gift of your being beyond your doing? And then the other thing that I find helpful personally is just rhythms of centering down with silence. Uh, Howard Thurman would say sometimes, God often speaks loudest in silence. And yet the challenge is that I have so much noise internally and externally that my capacity to hear the gentle whispers of the divine is often anemic. And so, what rhythm do I have of stopping, of slowing down? I find that silence is a really important practice for peoples whose vocation is so dependent on words. This is something that Henry Manowan talks about, the need to discover the ministry of silence and allowing silence to be the home of our speech. One other practice that I find helpful is often sermon preparation can be so sedentary. And so I like to walk and just kind of process my sermon through contemplative walks in nature. And then the last thing I would mention is retreats. I think retreats are very helpful. Again, not everyone has the resources or is in a season of life where they can go away for a 2 or 3 day retreat. But I do think most of us can have a 2-hour monthly retreat at a park or in an old sanctuary or in our garage, right? We can find spaces in which we cultivate this rhythm of retreat. And I think that's so important because who we are, again, shows up in the pulpit. If I'm not living a life that's helping me to pay attention to my interiority, both the shadow side and those things I want to celebrate, then that's going to come out in ways that will negatively impact others that I care about. So as Parker Palmer would talk about, self-care is not a selfish act, because when I care for myself, I care for the gift that I have to offer to others. I think that preachers have lots to learn from that wisdom.
My goodness. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Trey. Larry, what about you?
Yes, I will echo what's been mentioned. The thing I will add is I think spiritual practice can be a variety of things. Again, it's whatever makes us consciously connected with God, ourselves, and community. And sometimes for me, it's putting on music and dancing and getting back in my body. Right? Whatever it may be that day. Sometimes it's sitting in nature. Sometimes it's silence. Right? And so I think it's an invitation for people to figure out what works for them and to try different practices. What again, I don't have language for it, but when you like connected, when you feel like really connected, not only to God, but yes, to God, to yourself, and to other folks, like there's a feeling that you have, an experience, and experimenting to see what it's all the grace of God, but like what can you do? What can you practice to put yourself in a position to notice the divine in ways that again helps you come alive?
Well, my friends, our time has come. This has been such an incredibly rich conversation, and I'm so grateful for each of you and the gifts that you've offered us this evening. Friends, those of you who are joining us, we would invite you to catch up with us on social media, to get to know us a little bit better on our website and about our cohort program. We are thankful for the support of the Lilly Endowment and the Compelling Preaching Initiative. You can find out more about that grant initiative, which hosts 140 some now grants at compellingpreaching.org. We will have our next, we have 2 more webinars this year, web conversations this year. We will publish those dates and the topics in the coming weeks and months. We are grateful for the time that you've spent with us tonight. So peace to all of you. Invest in yourself and let us know how we can continue to journey with you. Take care. Good night.